Hello, my name is Keith Cross. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist and the owner and clinical director of the Prescott Relationship Center. I wanted to start today with the first of a three-part series on communication. It seems like a common topic that our couples come into the center with, and it's understandable. All too often, what we're thinking, feeling, believing, needing doesn't come through in our communication. So our first part today, we're going to sort of talk about sort of the why it is that we end up in this really challenging place where we can't seem to communicate to our partners in the ways that that work really. And then part two will be around sort of what it is that it actually looks like when we're not communicating well. How that essentially results in the disconnection in our relationship. And then finally, the third part will be on how to do it differently, how to do it in a way that's more effective and connecting. So let's jump in. I have these on some slides on PowerPoint that I'll just work through as we talk. So I'm going to move over to that. And here we go. So yes, first part here is again, why it is that we communicate the way that we do. All right, so I already explained sort of the three parts here, why we're communicating, what it looks like when we are disconnecting around communication, and then finally, what can we actually do about it. Most recent research and the theory that we are leaning towards nowadays around communication and our needs around that is attachment theory. I'll get into a little bit more into that in a few minutes, but for the most part, it does have to do with how our early experiences in this world influence who we are as adults, and therefore how we engage and communicate in our relationships. And I have to confess, when I was in graduate school and I first started learning about attachment theory, I really poo-pooed it. I really pushed it aside and said, that doesn't fit with me. What does my life as a 3-year-old toddler have to do with who I am today? I don't even remember what life was like, when I was 4. So how could that possibly impact me today? So I was very much a skeptic, and eventually I did learn about the connections and how they do actually impact us as adults, and that was a key to my personal and professional development as well. So we'll get a little bit more into that as well. But attachment theory does focus on the connection between early experiences with caregivers, on how we experience and express emotion and relationships and safety and trust throughout the lifespan. And as I'm sure you're aware, it is often through the expression of emotions that we have the most difficulty communicating. Some of the pieces here about attachment theory, which essentially asserts, by the way, on that last slide, I do want to, clarify that attachment theory is not a recent theory. And I think I did have the word recent on that last slide. Attachment theory was originally developed in the 50s and 60s, really starting to look at, again, how children were raised and how they interacted with their parents, and even more so how their parents reacted and responded to their kids, their babies, infants, newborns. And for many years, actually, there was a lot of pushback about attachment theory, and a lot of the quote-unquote cognitive behaviorists really pushed back and said, no, emotions and nurturing are not what's important. It's all about the ever important belief and cognitive pieces there that we need to focus on. And if we can just change how somebody is thinking, then we will therefore change their behavior, or vice versa. If we can change the behavior, we'll change their beliefs. So for a long time, attachment theory really had some challenges to being accepted in the field. Eventually, as people started looking a little bit more deeply into it. And the good thing is, actually nowadays we have the technology that allows us actually to look at brain scans, detailed brain scans of people who have had either positive experiences in their childhood versus those who had distant or unsecure attachments from their caregivers, as well as the difference between people who are in marriages and long-term relationships where there is a lot of conflict and arguing versus those who are in healthy adult relationships. And the data around those brain scans demonstrates to us what those early theorists were asserting way back in the 15s and 60s around attachment theory. So it has come full circle. It's great to see that we have plenty of data to back up what it is that we're basing our interventions off of nowadays. So I did want to mention that. Sorry, after I flipped over to this one. But anyway, so attachment theory does assert that as an infant, we continually monitor the accessibility of caregivers and tend to flee to this caregiver for safety in times of distress. We are dependent on our caregivers. We do, in quote unquote, what we call strange situations, need to be reassured that we have a place of safety and security in which to soothe that anxiety or that uncertainty in times of distress. And as I'm sure you've heard before, this is where the concepts of attachment and secure base come from. And it's through these attachment experiences that infants learn to cope or survive in their particular environment. So for the most part, how the parent is responding to that infant in those times of distress, are they responsive and caring and patient and loving or not? And we're going to talk about sort of what the differences are and how that can have an impact on your adult relationships and interactions with others. So when caregivers can't or don't meet the infant's needs, the infant's ability to manage his or her emotions is affected. And this is based somewhat on temperament. That's what the research is really coming down to, is that we all sort of tend to have at a basic fundamental level a tendency to either, in this case, pursue or withdraw. And these aren't typically the terms that we attach to how infants are engaging with their parents, but they are the terms we use in adult relationships, and as far as how it is that we're communicating or not with those people in adult relationships that we care about. So again, we'll get a little more into this so it makes a little bit more sense. But for the most part, data shows that the vast majority of us, well over 80% of most adults, do have a secure attachment to a caregiver early on. And regardless of whether you had a good experience with the caregiver in your early years, we do all tend to have that tendency to, again, either pursue or withdraw regardless. So we do all learn to interpret the interactions we had with our caregivers and apply these expectations for how we should be treated by others. It's how things work. So I'll just go ahead and go into that now, because even though you don't remember what those early experiences were, does not mean that they don't still influence you into adulthood. So let's take the example of, let's just say, an infant who in the high chair is either hot or cold, or wets their diaper, whatever the need is that infant has at the moment. The way that they communicate that to their caregiver, of course, they cry, right? So they cry, and then let's just say if they have that responsive, caring, loving person who comes over, takes them out of the high chair, figures out what they need, takes care of it, and again, in a loving, caring way, that person learns, okay, I can expect that the world will care for me. I can have trust in this world that my needs are important, and they will be responsive, and the world will be responsive to my needs. Okay. Then we take, let's just say, one of two scenarios. So let's just say that baby cries and cries and continues to cry and continues to cry, and then cries more and more and more. Now, if that parent, that caregiver, is not being responsive, well, obviously they're not being responsive to that infant in that moment. And let's just say whatever is going on for that caregiver there, that has influenced their responsiveness to that infant, it's likely that at that point, that caregiver is not exactly going to be responding very positively to that infant, okay? That person may very well be short with that infant toddler, maybe yank them out of the chair and change their diaper hastily or whatever it might be, change their clothes, whatever. And that infant learns, in many cases, that infant learns that in order to get my needs met, I can't just expect that the world will take care of me. I can't trust, I don't have the security in the world that it will take care of me and that my needs will be met. So I got to do whatever I got to do to get those needs met. So even if it means my interaction with that caregiver or the world isn't exactly going to be positive, I'd rather have some interaction than no interaction, even if it's negative. Again, so that person learns early on, I have to push and push and push to get my needs met. And I don't know how else to do it, so that's what I'm going to do. And we have to think long term. If that's sort of the template that person is looking through early on, and then they apply it to most of their through childhood and adult relationships, it's likely that that's going to perpetuate itself to where that person is really seeking out attention and requiring that attention from somebody. Again, even if it's negative, they will get that attention however they can. Conversely, there are individuals, let's just say infants, that they cry and cry and cry, needs aren't getting met, cry, 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 needs aren't being met. And instead of continuing to holler, scream, and cry, and even get negative attention, a lot of these infants will learn that it doesn't matter how much I cry, my needs won't be met, and learn that I can't trust the world to meet my needs, so I won't even ask. So instead of pushing to get even negative responses rather than no responses, these infants learn, I'm just going to give up. My needs aren't important. This world isn't a trustworthy place for me. I don't know how to get my needs met, so I will just suppress them. I will shut them down. I will stuff them. And again, think about what this looks like long term when that's the approach through childhood and early and into adulthood. My needs aren't important. I'm just going to suppress them. Or my feelings aren't important. It doesn't matter how much I holler. I'm not going to get any sort of responsiveness from someone I love. So they shut it down. Okay. So think about this as an adult in your adult romantic relationship. Okay. When you're in conflict, let's just say with your spouse or partner or other important people in your life, do you often feel like you're pulling teeth to get them to talk? Are you asking questions and asking questions and asking questions, and maybe it doesn't matter how much you try, they're not exactly responsive to you, or eventually maybe they lash out and say fine, or whatever the response might be? Or do you tend to avoid confrontation altogether? Whatever I got to do to stop any sort of conflict, because again, I don't know how to communicate. I don't know how to get my needs met. I don't know. I don't believe that my needs are important enough, so I'm going to push them, suppress them. And that often leads to an avoidance of confrontation or in many cases, communication altogether, okay? Another way to look at this: when you're angry, do you feel like crawling into a shell? When you're distressed, do you feel like shutting down? Do you just want to sort of go in a quiet room and not talk, not communicate? Or some pursuers, do you tend to be critical of others and maybe yourself as well? Is that sometimes how you get that person to eventually communicate to you? A lot of pursuers will talk about sort of feeling like that they have to sort of whip this dead horse, to get any sort of reaction from their partner. And in some cases, the only way to get any sort of reaction is through being critical. And sometimes that creates an ongoing downward spiral where that pursuer pushes to get the withdrawer to talk. The withdrawer doesn't want to talk. The withdrawer doesn't know how to engage. They try and shut down, stop the process. And the more that person pulls away, the more the pursuer pushes. And then sometimes the withdrawer finally just says, screw it, and will yell or holler or literally physically leave the situation, whatever it might be. Or sometimes it's a, whatever, or yes, dear, whatever that might look like from the withdrawer perspective. And by the way, it's very important to remember, neither of these approaches are either A, healthy, right? It's just the way that we learn to engage and communicate. But it's ultimately important as well to know and truly believe that neither one of them is right or better. They are just the ways that we've learned, and we oftentimes don't know any other way to communicate, so that's what we default to. Ultimately, pursuers pursue because it's the only way they know how to engage with others, and they oftentimes have a fear of being rejected. That pursuer, again, think of that infant who's in that seat, who's crying and crying and crying to get their needs met. They're used to eventually getting someone to respond. Even if it's negative, somebody will eventually respond. But if they don't, that pursuer really is really challenged to feel like they're not even important even for negative attention. So again, on the contrary, the withdrawers withdraw because they don't know how to engage with the other. In many cases, fear appearing inadequate or incompetent. Think about that pattern that develops where maybe that pursuer is using criticism to try and get that withdrawer to engage, to get that withdrawer to talk, and somehow, some way, it just doesn't work. But eventually, yeah, that withdrawer, may respond in some way, but usually it's not positive. But regardless, that criticism does often pile up on that withdrawer, and it often results in them fearing that appearing inadequate or incompetent. Unfortunately, we have a lot of data that shows that pursuers often attract withdrawers, and withdrawers often attract pursuers. In many cases, this is often something, sort of an endearing quality of the relationship when, a withdrawer can say, oh, she finishes my sentences, and, I don't really ever have to think about what we need to talk about. She's always got something to talk about. And the pursuer is saying he never interrupts me, and it's great because I can just talk about my day, and he's just there and doesn't push, doesn't criticize. So unfortunately, that over time, that dynamic turns out to be a downward spiral and really hurts the relationship in the long run. Oftentimes, married, engaged, and dating couples end up coping with stress or conflict in rigid and predictable ways. One will criticize or pursue. The other one will try to get, in order to try and get the withdrawer to talk, and the other one will hide or withdraw in order to stop the other from pursuing. And unfortunately, again, the more one withdraws, the more the other pursues. The more one pursues, the more the other withdraws. So it really is an unfortunate reality. So that's part one. Where we're going to go from here is, okay, so that's part one. What we're going to do is shift gears. In part two, we're going to talk more about sort of that pursuer-withdrawer relationship and how that communication pattern often results in disconnection. And then for part three, we'll go into more detail as far as what to do about it, how to change it. And actually get your needs met, communicate the way you want or need to communicate to get what you need in the relationship, and create positive change. So look forward to it, and we'll see you for part two.